Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of this week. I've actually decided to combine what was going to be two lectures into one. I just figured that they flow very nicely together and can easily be done in one lecture. So instead of having three little separate lectures this week, you're only going to have two. So this one is going to deal with the content of the class for this week, and then the next lecture is going to deal with the short writing assignment. So I'm combining the two and calling it TERF Bangs and Feminist Futures. We have covered a lot for our 6 weeks. We started off this course introducing ourselves, one, to queer theory and feminist theory, but very much looking at the dialogue, sometimes very tense dialogue, between queer theory studies and feminist theory studies. From there, we then talked about sexism and how heterosexism is connected to it, heteronormativity is connected to it. We then went on to the social construction of gender and gender performance, which then led us into then talking about sexual hierarchies around the charm circle to compulsory heterosexuality, leading us to last week where we looked very much at homonormativity and what I would call heteronormativity in disguise. Something that's supposed to be really not heteronormative is actually super heteronormative. We're now kind of circling back to where we began, looking at queer feminist politics again, from everything that we've talked about, retouching on this subject and expanding it a little bit further. So, going back to the first week. During the first week, we talked about how feminism and queer theory, activism, politics, research have not had a super friendly relationship. There has been a lot of tense discussions, politics, fighting between queer activists and feminist activists. And as we talked about in the first week, a lot of it has to do with queer theory, queer activists critiquing feminist theory, activism for its essentialist politics. And, something that is not actually unique to queer theory critiquing them. Black feminists have critiqued the women's movement around essentialist politics as well. Working class women, feminists have also critiqued it. International women outside of the West have also critiqued around how Western feminism has really sort of dependent on these essential politics, very much on this idea of what it means to be a woman and what is it a woman's experience, very much dependent on cisgender, a lot of times race, white, as well as economic standing, usually middle class. And for queer interventions and discussion and critiques around feminism, very much talking to how feminist politics has really, despite as much as, feminist politics are supposed to be deconstructing the gender binary, to point out the hypocrisy around the gender hierarchy and the way that women are subjugated, they also depend so much on this essentialist thinking around what it means to be a woman versus what it means to be a man that they basically reinforce the gender binary as well as the sexual binary around, a strict division between heterosexual and homosexual. And queer theorists and politicians and politics have also sort of critiqued the women's movement of overemphasizing identity politics. Again, I am a woman. I need these rights because I'm a woman. Over actually political concerns, thinking about that. It's not just that you need these rights because you're a woman, but let's talk about the larger systemic oppression. A lot of it has to do with economic injustice, social injustice, and so forth. And very importantly, it all gets down to a lack of intersectionality, which was brought forward by women of color, queer women of color as well, black feminists, etc., saying that we need to think about experiences. One is intersectional, that we all come with our own privileges and disadvantages, but also that differences matter. And that we can't have this essentialist thinking around what it means to be a woman, and they're also build up our movement on these ideas of rights and politics and so forth, when we're not talking about other systemic oppressions that are very much connected to the oppression against women, such as racial injustice, economic injustice, religious persecution, ability, able-bodiedness, and so forth. We need to start. We need to start, our movement intersectionally, or we're going to be leaving a lot of people out. And that gets into what I touched a little bit upon on the first week, but I want to go more in depth with this lecture, which is around the not so great history of the women's movement and feminist movement and trans inclusivity. And you can really sort of summarize the issue into 2 points. One, that there is this debate that trans people either uphold gender norms and therefore run, I guess, counter to the feminist movement because they are actually maintaining the gender hierarchy because I guess they're transgender. But then you also have queer theorists like Judith Butler saying, no, they're not upholding gender norms. They're still dismantling them. Even if somebody transitions, from one gender to the other, kind of doing a binary transition, which is their right, doesn't mean that they're not dismantling it. The fact that they are transitioning, the fact that they are, questioning and challenging, and the fact that their very life is a challenge, to gender norms, especially heteronormativity, which, again, has this very one model around body equals, gender equals genitalia, which equals sexual orientation, straight, which equals attraction, to women, which equals a certain gender relationship, etc., right? The other sort of debate is that trans people are incredibly privileged and therefore they're not representative of the struggles of the women's rights movement. And this, as I'm going to talk about in the next slide, is very much directed towards both trans women and trans men. And it's this idea essentially that, for trans women, that because they were assigned a different gender at birth, they got to live in the privilege of that gender, male, and then until they, transitioned. And therefore they cannot understand the real experiences of a woman. But it even goes further than that, as to the point that, particularly in the early years, in the second wave feminist movement, trans women especially were seen as threats to the women's movement, as almost devious interlopers who were trying to dismantle the women's movement from within. And I'm going to just share a couple sentiments of that because it still has its traces today. So I am going to sort of give a trigger warning that I'm going to be drawing quotes from feminists from the 70s, 80s, and 90s about this. They're using pretty offensive language to refer to trans people. But again, the reason why I'm doing this is because these sentiments around trans people still exist and are very much so present within the women's movement. So the first example I want to share is at the 1973 West Coast Lesbian Conference in Los Angeles. Robin Morgan, who was very much angry that a trans folk singer was there also to be a part of the conference, and said very famously, "I will not call a male she," referring to this trans woman who was a folk singer there. "I will not call a male she. 32 years of suffering in this androcentric society and of surviving have earned me the title woman. One walk down the street by a male transvestite, 5 minutes of his being hassled, which he may enjoy, and then he dares to think he understands our pain. No, in our mother's names and in our own, we must not call him sister. It was during the second wave that more and more public attention was being shown and just started to show for individuals going through transition. Renee Richards, a very popular tennis player, was a pioneer and very brave by publicly, showing and allowing people into her transition. So, as more and more medical advances and more trans people were becoming much more public about their transitioning, the women's movement at the time, also a big, strong component. Many of the mainstream feminists vehemently rejected trans women from the movement and saw their transitioning as an affront to feminism and to women. Gloria Steinman, who has now since taken back this statement, talks about her ignorance. At the time, said about Renee Richards transitioning that it was a frightening instance of what feminism could lead to, or as living proof that feminism isn't necessary. At a minimum, it was a diversion from the widespread problems of sexual inequality. Basically, that trans women are distracting from the women's movement, which sounds a lot familiar to how the women's movement at the time were treating lesbian women as being a diversion or not necessary to the movement. So there you have that. Interesting parallel. As well as almost as a threat to the women's movement, that as more and more, particularly trans women, were becoming public about their transitioning, that people could use that as an attack against feminism, that something that's, that feminism is making men into women, which is grossly offensive to trans women, because it's not about men wanting to become women. They're women. Women being women. But it was seen very much as a threat. And this idea continued. So it's not just in the 70s, that there was this incredible amount of backlash with the public attention around transitioning. It continued, and it still continues. Mary Daly in 1987 wrote that, basically described transitioning as a Frankenstein phenomenon, and which is incredibly disgustingly offensive. But she wrote, that today the Frankenstein phenomenon is omnipresent in phallocentric technology. Transsexualism is an example of male surgical siring, which invades the female world with substitutes. Basically, saying that trans women were these sort of, I guess, like secret agents coming into the women's movement in order to dismantle it. That they wanted to transition precisely for that, to, I guess, destroy the women's movement from within. It's like, saying this out loud, it's so incredibly ridiculous. But yeah, this idea that now it's going to be full of these substituted women, as if, again, that trans women aren't women, or a lesser form of woman, I guess. Very cis-normative there. And then, continue today, one who takes the cake is Germaine Greer, who's a British feminist and still very much maintains these ideas. And she wrote from the very beginning around trans women as being threats, not only to the women's movement, but are just mere representation of the patriarchal society, that they're still basically, in her eyes, trans women, again, a lot of these were attacks against trans women, that trans women are still just men trying to take over women. And she wrote in 1999, and again, she still holds these beliefs, that governments that consist of a very few women have hurried to recognize as women men who believe that they are women and have had themselves castrated to prove it, because they see women not as another sex but as a non-sex. Not so called sex change has ever begged for a uterus and ovaries transplant, which is not true. Many have tried. Many trans women have advocated around these sort of for uterus and ovaries transplants. So that is one, not true. If uterus and ovaries transplants were made mandatory for wannabe women, incredibly offensive, they would disappear overnight. Also not true. The insistence that man-made women be accepted as women in this institutional expression of the mistaken conviction that women are defective males. Okay, no. That's all I'm going to say. Not today. Not today, Satan. All right. So with this, then, we have two main. I'm going to lump them up as two main thoughts that have encompassed. That have been encompassed in the women's movement that is very much against trans inclusivity. One, this idea that because trans persons have lived previously as a different gender, the gender they were assigned to at birth, or have transitioned to a different gender, that they cannot understand nor should they be included in the struggle many cisgender women experience because of patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny. This is very much directed it's directed towards trans men too, but it's very much directed towards trans women, that because their experiences are not the same as other cisgendered women, they should not be seen as being equal or equivalent, and that they are still living a life of male privilege. Which, again, speaks to this idea of what happened to intersectionality. Where did that go? Around this, like, people's experiences shouldn't be seen the same. All right. The other idea that I sort of summarize these sort of arguments around trans inclusivity in the feminist women's movement is that the idea that because trans people transition, that they actually don't dismantle the gender binary and instead maintain it or reinforce this. This is often directed to trans men, especially, unfortunately, from the cis lesbian community, which sort of look at formerly lesbian women who've transitioned into men, straight men, that they have basically reneged on their L card and have instead become heteronormative patriarchal servants. One issue with that is that this argument that because you've transitioned, you're therefore not dismantling the gender binary. Well, that's one critique of this, is that it's a very limited idea of what trans people's lives. Because yes, there are some trans people out there who do want to transition, from the gender that they were assigned to at birth, male or female, to then the gender of their authentic self, male or female. And they do sort of, move to the opposite side. That's the experience for some trans people. That's not the only experience, though. And there are many trans people who consider themselves to be non-binary, or even if they do identify within the binary system of male and female, don't see themselves and shouldn't be seen as being complicit in the system. The very fact that they have to survive so many ordeals in order to be their authentic self shows that they are, just by their lives alone, have to dismantle the gender binary that's very much based on cis normativity. But again, these are sort of the arguments placed onto trans people as to why they shouldn't be, or they aren't, or they're a threat to the women's movement. So This gets into TERFs, which it's trans exclusionary radical feminist. And, using these two arguments that they weren't, that particularly that towards trans women, that because you were not assigned at birth as a woman and therefore were raised as a woman, you cannot share in the experiences of gender oppression the same way that cis women might. And that because you've transitioned, you are therefore complicit in patriarchy instead of fighting against it. And there's a lot of feminists, particularly in the Women's March on Washington, who maintain this belief and believe that trans people, because they critique the essentialism of the women's rights movement, it's particularly around, like, vagina, the pussy hat, and so forth, that, instead, like, why can't we be a little bit more inclusionary, and that not all women have vaginas, and not all, and then there's many men who have vaginas, so maybe we should talk more about the regulation of people's bodies instead of just the pussy, and making it, only about women, right? Instead, they see that really important critique around intersectionality as trans women hating women, or trans people hating women. And that's where you get the TERF bang, which is this internet meme around the sort of trans exclusionary radical feminist and just the penchant for short, very, very short bangs. Now, it's a joke, and it's meant to be, cutting and controversial. But it, and if, for those of you who maybe have these bangs, don't worry. I don't think you're a TERF because you have them. It was just sort of a way to sort of discuss, and that's why I use TERF bangs. But that's essentially what it is that it's in reference to a popular hairstyle that has been attributed to trans exclusionary radical feminists. But not all have those bangs, and those who have those bangs aren't all TERFs. Right? Intersectionality. Of course, I think it's really important that, these trans exclusionary politics, it's nice to see that they're becoming more and more on the fringe, or at least seen as being an exception to a more inclusive feminism. And I think you have to thank a lot of people for that. Obviously, trans activists, but also, and very importantly, women of color, because they have been fighting around, inclusion, diversity, discussing and confronting power structures within the feminist movement that have marginalized women of color. And they have been, particularly black feminists, but all women of, a lot of women of color feminists have really been the ones who have stepped up and to talk about inclusivity, and that diversity is important, and we can talk about diverse experiences. And, the Black Lives Matter movement has been, has had its own issues around trans inclusion, but have also, for the most part, their activists have fought very hard to try to make it so that trans people are included in it. And, I think that the shout out has to go there, because I think it's really, it makes sense. Particularly, women of color, black feminists, their whole work within their tireless and a lot of times not, appreciated or thanked enough, efforts within the feminist movement had been around confronting essentialism and inequality and in advocating for diversity and intersectionality. So I want to talk a little bit about diversity and how that's important. And I'm going to talk a little bit through the controversy that of Chimamanda Adichie. So about a year ago, Chimamanda, who is, somebody that I deeply admire, I love her writing. She's a brilliant feminist author and so forth, um, had said in an interview, they were talking, she's become, for whether she wanted to or not, a mouthpiece around the feminist movement as, a woman of color, a woman outside of the West, a Nigerian woman, just so many things, right? And she talks about, and in that first interview, she said, they were talking about, they asked her a question around trans women being part of the women's rights movement, the feminist movement. And she said this. She said that trans women are trans women, that they are people who have been born male, benefited from the privileges that the world affords men, and that we should not say that the experience of women born female is the same as the experience of trans women. So, notwithstanding, Chimamanda got a lot of backlash, basically saying that people took her statement as that are you saying that trans women aren't women? Are you saying that their experiences are not equal or should not be included or have a seat at the table around cis women's experiences around patriarchy and violence and so forth? And in response, she wrote what I think is an eloquent discussion of what she meant by this. And it leads me into our discussion around intersectionality and diversity. She said, because again, there was a lot of backlash and people were calling her transphobic and so forth. She said, we can oppose violence against trans women while also acknowledging differences, because we should be able to acknowledge differences while also being supportive, because we do not have to insist in the name of being supportive that everything is the same, because we run the risk of reducing gender to a single essentialist thing. And then she says, looking back at the interview, I should have said that trans women are trans women and cis women are cis women and all are women, meaning that their experiences are different. That doesn't mean that they're not all women, but also we should recognize those differences, because they're going to be, if we want to talk about a coalitionary politics, of coalition around the particular violences that trans people face versus maybe the particular violence that cis women may face, especially as they're growing up. We should think of this as not as a bad thing by recognizing these differences. And she says here that I see how my saying that we should not conflate the gender experiences of trans women with that of women born female could appear as if I was suggesting that one experience is more important than the other, or that the experiences of trans women are less valid than those of women born female. I do not think so at all. I know that trans women can be vulnerable in ways that women born female are not. This, again, is a reason to not deny the differences. It all goes back to intersectionality. Again, I think it's important to recognize differences. And I think also, for the trans activists that I've worked with and my family members, that we can talk about shared oppressions as well as different experiences to that oppression. And that in both cases, whether you are cis or trans, that we can still join together around essentialist politics, around oppression, and so forth. But we can also talk about different experiences of privilege. So I have a very good friend who is a trans man. And, we've talked a lot about, and he's shared with me a lot about how the world has changed for him in different ways now that he's transitioned. Whereas, so he's a science major and he does work in chemistry and so forth, and he transitioned while he was still in university. And he very much clearly remembers that prior to his transitioning, when he would raise his hand or speak or even do assignments in class, even he would be graded less than his male counterparts. He would be oftentimes not called upon, or he would have to fight really hard to make his point. Now that he is transitioned, and he's very much somebody who lives a lot of his life without a lot of people not knowing that he is trans. He talks about, yeah, I see this in a very stark reality now, that when I raise my hand, I always get called on. I always get the top marks in class, even though I did the same work prior to my transitioning. Um, I don't have to repeat myself to make a point across. I don't have to speak out. And that speaks to privilege. I mean, that speaks to gender, right? And the gender hierarchy that affords male, masculine, male bodied individuals certain privileges, the simple ones of being listened to. That does not mean that my friend does not experience incredible amounts of gender violence and sexism and so forth. He does. And he experiences a lot of, precarity as a trans man in a society that's very heteronormative and cis sexist. But we can talk about privilege and I think, that by talking about that, yes, for my friend, he does experience certain sorts of male privilege that were not available to him prior to transitioning. Does not mean then that he's part of the system, or that he's supporting gender in hierarchies, and that he can't fully still participate and talk about his experiences of gender violence and injustice with cisgender women's experiences of violence and injustice, because at the core we're still talking about gender. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge differences. I think it is fine to say that trans women's experiences will be different than cis women's experiences, but they're all still women. Same thing for men, right? They're all still men, or whatever. At the core, when we sort of base our social justice on a very limited definition of identity, we screw ourselves in the end, because we're not actually dealing with the real power in the room, which is around gender, right? We kind of just sort of nitpick each other instead of looking at who's really pulling the strings. And this gets back into queer feminism, which we've already discussed a bit in the first week, and just sort of reiterate what I said, that it's very much on this idea of the politics over identity politics. Again, what's the larger issue here? Who's really pulling the strings? Why are we nitpicking each other on who has more validating experiences than the other? Instead, who's really pulling the strings? And therefore, then we can build a coalition across identities, not only identities around cis and trans, but race, ability, geolocation, economics, and so forth. And that we can talk about a multiplicity of genders by saying, by acknowledging different gendered experiences does not negate or erase, women's rights. And the fact that, in general, females and the whole spectrum of femininity is still devalued in this patriarchal society. And that also that we can still fight around binaries, even if we ourselves sort of fit a binary model of our gender identity or our sexual identity. That doesn't mean that you're supporting it just because of who you are and how you feel and so forth. We can still dismantle it, and we should. And we should, always be wary of a sort of, black or white model, because nobody's ever black or white. I want to talk about queer feminism in a bit more detail. Essentially, you can talk about queer feminism as a radical opposition to patriarchy. It's radical in the sense that instead of just talking about just addressing patriarchy, you have to talk about intersecting, interconnected other forms of violences, such as racism, or ableism, or homophobia, transphobia, but also larger systems of violence, stemming from colonialism, globalization, and so forth. That you can't talk just about patriarchy and patriarchal violence, misogyny, as if it's in a bubble, not connected to these other forms of violence, and especially historical ongoing violences. And very much as a radical opposition to patriarchy, queer feminism is very, again, against strict rules about gender and sexuality that hurt everyone, whether male, female, both, or neither. And queer feminism is very much against the blaming and shaming of trans people, queer people, sexually active, not sexually active people who do not fit into sort of a narrow body, gender, sexual norm. Queer feminism is very much an opponent and critiques rape culture within our society. And then the last point, which I'm going to talk about a bit more, has been a critique around what I would consider mainstream feminism, which has been a very much a liberal, democratic feminism, which sort of sees, democracy, liberalism as the fix it all for all society problems. So queer feminism has very much critiqued liberal feminism, or what I would call the mainstream feminist movement. So and so much about the mainstream feminist movement has about recognizing human rights for women, both within the law, state, and society. Now, human rights are often used in this black or white way. They're either seen as sort of a symbol for liberalism, capitalism, and individualism by some, or seen as development, social justice, and means to peace by others. Queer feminists are very much a critique around liberalist politics, in that they see that this sort of liberalism is very much based on individual rights, the individual, and that these individual assumptions make it difficult to see the ways in which underlying social structures and values disadvantage individuals. For most of the first wave and second wave feminist movement, as well as the third wave movement as well, it has been dependent on this liberalist strategy, recognizing individual rights. Focusing on rights and repression and representation under mostly the law and in the state or in government. Queer feminists would argue that even if women are not dependent upon individual men, they are still dependent upon a patriarchal state. These critics, believe that institutional changes like the introduction of women's suffrage or multitude of other sort of laws to guarantee women's equal access to resources, protections, and so forth are insufficient to actually emancipate women or other minorities. The emphasis on identity politics further separates individuals from not only equal representation under the law, but equal access to it. And a big critique around liberal feminists has been that mainstream liberal feminists, have built a model that around human rights that very much just reflects only the values of middle class, heterosexual white women, and has largely ignored women of different races, cultures, or classes. The emphasis on identity politics has led to individualization and a fragmentation of large groups of people. And queer feminists argue that our struggles must be united, even as they negotiate and recognize difference. That we must make alliances across national borders to fight, not ally ourselves with either just, two political parties, right? Republican or Democrat. And, queer feminists very much go and attack this sort of dominant narrative in liberal feminism that equality for women will be achieved by the passage of laws and policies, ignoring the fact that capitalism actually prevents full equality. While it's true that, we should fight for progressive laws because we do live in a democracy and, but at the same time, queer feminists say, like, we shouldn't see such achievements as simply steps on a ladder to liberation. Full liberation requires a different strategy, one that is not limited to racking up democratic victories, but aims at tearing down the larger structures of inequality, i.e., capitalism. And also with that, there's like this dependency on like laws will set us free. Well, one, laws are not neutral. They reflect the dominant order. Equality in law does not automatically mean equality in life. Why then must we work within a system that is inherently oppressive? And while some feminists may attribute women's marginalization, subordination to the sexism of individual people, queer feminists would argue that misogyny does not merely exist in the minds of individuals. It is first and foremost a system of inequality, especially material inequality, economic inequality. Capitalism benefits from the wage gap and the continuous downward drive of wages. Capitalism depends on the gender wage gap. Capitalism also benefits when domestic labor is viewed as natural, intrinsically female, and therefore remains unpaid. And although sexism has existed long before capitalism arrived, the end of capitalism is not the same as the end of sexism. Capitalism has garnered massive profits from sexism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia. For like every woman CEO that's there, every woman who's broken the glass ceiling, there is a woman who is paid miserable wages to clean her bathroom. And within the system, therefore, can be no equality. It doesn't matter how far a select few women rise to the top. Because if we're not all equal, then there is no equality. And even step forwards are deeply contradictory. This leads us to our writing assignment. Is that okay? So with these critiques in mind, and really sort of thinking about the mainstream social justice movements, whether that's the women's rights movement, to Black Lives Matter, to many others, what would be necessary for a queer feminist future? One that does not reproduce the power structures that are here and doesn't have to play the game in order to get kind of like a measly piece or a crumb. Instead, something that can actually create a future where we're all free. So we're going to be exploring this more in our short paper assignment, but right now I'm going to say goodbye and have you think about it.